So here we're going to look at the defense mechanisms against acid-base disturbances. So we talked about 4 disturbances, 2 that were caused in the lungs, that's respiratory acidosis and respiratory alkalosis, and then 2 that were created by any other means outside of the lungs, and that was metabolic acidosis and metabolic alkalosis. Here we're going to speak about how the body has 3 mechanisms to kind of defend us against these acid-base disturbances. And there are 3 lines of defense. The first one is the buffering of those hydrogen ions. And I talked about a buffer earlier on, and I said that a buffer was anything that kind of resists or limits any change in pH. And we talked about 2 buffers. One was hemoglobin, specifically the deoxyhemoglobin, and the other one was bicarbonate. More importantly, bicarbonate. Now, buffers can limit the change in pH, so they can kind of prevent any changes in pH, but they do have their limitation. They cannot reverse existing changes in pH. So if you are in a state of these disturbances, if you are actively in respiratory acidosis or in a metabolic alkalosis, a buffer is not going to help you. A buffer is going to prevent or limit a situation from getting worse. It's going to prevent excess changes in the blood pH, but it's not going to correct or reverse or compensate for any existing acid-base disturbances. So the buffering is really probably the first line of defense, and it's really only good at limiting changes, but not at correcting changes. The other 2 mechanisms are much better at correcting or compensating for any existing changes or any existing acid-base disturbances. And the first one is going to be the lungs, which can reverse changes in the pH by changing our ventilation. So this is what I kind of talked about earlier. The lungs can kind of kick in and compensate for any changes that are happening by adequately or appropriately regulating our ventilation, either increasing it or decreasing it to lose or hold on to more acid. And then the kidneys can also play a part in compensating any existing disturbance as well. So the kidneys are going to either secrete more hydrogen ions and reabsorb more bicarb, or the kidneys can secrete less hydrogen ions and reabsorb less bicarb. So we talked about the 2 roles of the kidneys in terms of acid base. The kidneys have the ability to secrete hydrogen ions through the proximal tubule, the distal tubule, and the collecting duct. And they also have the role of reabsorbing bicarbonate through the proximal tubule only. So as a mechanism of regulating our acid base, the kidneys can increase their rate of secretion of hydrogen ions and increase their rate of reabsorption of bicarbonate. They can also decrease the rate of secretion of hydrogen ions and decrease the rate of reabsorption of bicarb, depending on whatever the acid-base balance looks like. Okay, so here we've got, this is pretty much a bit of repetition from what we talked about before, but we're talking about some of the main buffers. In our extracellular fluid, the main buffer is bicarbonate. Okay, I talked about hemoglobin being one, but bicarb is probably the more important buffer in terms of our extracellular fluid. And that is going to bind up some of this excess hydrogen ions and buffer pH changes in the extracellular fluid. Inside our cells, the main buffers are proteins, so whatever proteins are inside our cells, as well as phosphates. So proteins and phosphates have the ability to bind the excess hydrogen ions and kind of soak them up or mop them up, and again, resist any changes to the pH inside the cells. So our main extracellular buffer is bicarbonate, and our intracellular buffers are going to be things like proteins and phosphates. Okay, now we get to speaking about the respiratory compensation. So this is how the lungs can kick in and compensate or correct any acid-base disturbance. And this is usually a short-term or immediate form of compensation. This takes anywhere from minutes to maybe an hour or so, so very short term in terms of having an effect. And this is brought about by regulating or varying our ventilation. So if we're in a state of, let's say, acidosis, the kidneys will kick in and they will increase the ventilation so that we can increase our rate of breathing and we can blow off more of that CO2 more quickly, and we can decrease our plasma CO2 levels, which will effectively decrease our acidity in the blood and bring our pH back to normal. On the other end of the spectrum, if we're in an alkalotic state, if we're in an alkalosis, meaning we have too little acid and too much base or too much bicarb, the kidneys, again, can chip in. They can vary or decrease our rate of ventilation so that we're not blowing off CO2 as quickly. We're holding on to that CO2, which is basically holding on to that acid, that acidity, and we can correct our pH, bringing it back to where it needs to be. So this is that connection that I talked about with varying the rate of ventilation and correcting any underlying acid-base disturbance by either holding on to excess CO2 or blowing off excess CO2. And this is a flow chart that kind of goes through an example of that. So this is looking at a decrease in plasma pH or an acidotic state as the main stimulus here. And that is going to trigger our peripheral chemoreceptors. So remember, chemoreceptors are receptors that are in our blood that are detecting the level of chemicals. And so they're detecting the level of acidity, of hydrogen ions. And when they detect that we have a decrease in our pH, meaning that we have lots of acid or an increased acidity, lots of hydrogen ions, is another way we can represent this, they are going to send a signal to the respiratory centers, which will increase our rate of ventilation, helping us to blow off more of that CO2 more quickly, which will in turn decrease the plasma concentration of CO2, which will correct our plasma pH, and that will turn off the signal as a negative feedback loop, okay? So this is how plasma pH, whether it's acidic or basic, can be detected by the chemoreceptors, and then that can respond by varying our rate of ventilation in an effort to correct that initial plasma pH disturbance. And we can look at this scenario in the opposite as well. So while this is only looking at a decrease in plasma pH, we can think about this as happening if the reverse were true. If we had an alkalotic state, this would work to decrease the plasma pH, again, bringing us back to a stable blood pH or plasma pH. Okay. So that is how the kidneys can chip in and correct some of those acid-base disturbances. Let's talk about how the kidneys can chip in and correct those acid-base disturbances. And we're not going to go too much in detail here into the mechanism. Just in the interest of time, we're probably going to end it here. And I'm going to give you an assignment as a part of take home, but we're not going to go into the mechanism just because we don't have time, and it's not as important as understanding the overall disturbances and the overall compensations. So the third line of defense in the kidneys, this is more of a long-term regulation. So whereas the lungs can take effect, can vary the ventilation more quickly, the kidneys respond much slower. This takes anywhere from hours to days. And this regulates either by excreting hydrogen ions or by excreting bicarbonate into the urine. And so we can use the kidneys to help correct any of those acid-base disturbances as well. So the effects of an increased acidotic state, the kidneys are going to increase their rate of hydrogen ion secretion, which is losing that into the tubular fluid, which is losing that into the urine, which is losing that acid out of the body. They will also increase the rate of bicarbonate reabsorption, which is holding on to more bicarb, moving it across the proximal tubule cell and back into the blood. And again, if we are in a state of acidosis, we want to hold on to bicarbonate, which is going to help to correct that acidosis. And then a third way that the kidneys can chip in and correct disturbances is by creating new bicarbonate in the kidney. So the kidneys across the epithelial cells of the tubules, the kidneys have a way of making new bicarb. So we can reabsorb bicarb from the urine, from the filtrate, but we can also create or synthesize new bicarb as a mechanism of correcting acid-base disturbances. And again, this is only looking at states of acidity, but you want to think about this in the reverse as well. If you're in a state of excess alkalosis or excess an alkalotic state, the kidneys will do the reverse. They're going to decrease their rate of secretion of hydrogen ions, holding on to that hydrogen ion, holding on to that acidity to correct an alkalosis. They are going to decrease their rate of reabsorption of bicarb, right? If you're in an alkalotic state, you want to lose bicarb. And they're going to decrease their rate of synthesizing new bicarb. Again, if you're in an alkalotic state, you're not going to hold on to bicarb. You're going to be attempting to lose it into the urine or decrease your rate of synthesizing new bicarb. Alrighty. Okay, now the next 4 slides, again, I'm going to skip over the mechanism, which is basically these 1, 2, 3, 4 slides. So you can completely cross those off. And then the next 4 slides, which go into the compensation, so the respiratory acidosis compensation, the respiratory alkalosis compensation, and then the metabolic compensations, I want you to practice looking at a table. So I want you to practice making a table as a study tool for these compensations. And you should be able to predict, given what we talked about so far today, you should be able to predict what would the lungs do to correct a respiratory acidosis? Would they hypoventilate or would they hyperventilate? So I want you to create a table with 4 rows, right? 1 for respiratory acidosis, 1 for respiratory alkalosis, metabolic acidosis, metabolic alkalosis coming down. And then across, I want you to create 3 columns. What's going to happen to ventilation? What's going to happen to hydrogen ion secretion? And what's going to happen to bicarbonate ion reabsorption? So you're going to create a table, the 4 disturbances going down, and then the 3 rows being ventilation, hydrogen ion secretion, and bicarb reabsorption, and kind of predict how the body would compensate for each of these disturbances. And I will come back during our review with a table that is what your table should look like, and we'll kind of discuss that table as a summary next week. So create that table as a part of homework, and we'll look at what your table should look like during our review